A squabble over spending is dominating today's federal election campaign. The government says there's a huge black hole in Labor's election promises, initially putting it at $67 billion. But under pressure to explain the numbers, the figure was revised to somewhere between $32 billion and $67 billion. While the government's criticism of Labor's spending is a constant, figures in this year's budget show the coalition's spending is also at historic highs. A short time ago, the Treasurer Scott Morrison joined me from Canberra. Treasurer, thank you for coming in.
Thanks a lot, Leigh. Good to be with you.
The past 3 years of coalition spending makes you one of the highest spending governments in decades. On average, your spending as a proportion of GDP is more than the previous Labor governments. Why do you keep persisting with the fantasy that it's Labor alone with the spending problem? Well,
a lot of the spending we're now engaged in, Leigh, has been locked in over many years. I mean, particularly when you look at the National Disability Insurance Scheme. These were commitments that were made under previous governments and supported at a bipartisan level, and a lot of additional spending has been locked in. Now, our plan is to get that down to 25.2% as a share of the economy. That's what I outlined in the budget, and that's where we're heading. Our opponents in this election want to keep spending more.
25.2% is still pretty high spending.
I think it's still too high, Leigh, and I've made that comment before. And it's important that we continue to control spending going forward. Sadly, Bill Shorten just wants to spend like there's no tomorrow.
You keep talking about Australia's need to live within its means. You're forecasting deficits of $85 billion over the next 4 years. How is that living within our means?
Well, within 4 years, we'll have the deficit down to $6 billion, 0.3% as a share of the economy. And the projections, and I stress they're only projections, have us the budget back in balance in 2021. Now, that's the trajectory we're on based on our commitments, both on revenue and on expenditure. The Labor Party, though, have a very different trajectory because they're spending more and they're taxing more.
Well, let's stick with your trajectory for the time being. Last week's pre-election economic and fiscal outlook says that the timetable you're talking about, the trajectory for the return to surplus, is very sensitive to underlying assumptions. I think in non-economic boffin speak, that's telling me he's dreaming.
No, what that means is that it's a sensitive economy that's out there, and the forecasts that are in the budget and were confirmed in the PFO statement, confirmed by the Secretary of Treasury, confirmed by the Secretary of the Ministry of Finance, they confirmed those forecasts. Now, they're the forecasts they provided to me as Treasurer, and they're the forecasts that are in the budget. Now, it is a sensitive time, Leigh, but I stress that in the MyEFO document at the end of last year, we revised down our projections on growth, and I still think we have very modest expectations of growth and consistent with where the rest of the world is.
But to give you an idea of how tenuous those assumptions are and what they're pointing out in PFO, the timetable for the return to surplus relies on revenue surging as a proportion of GDP to a ratio we've only seen twice in the past 40 years. That's the sort of luck you're relying on.
Well, no, what we're relying on is a growth returning to 3%. Now, we actually had a 3% growth rate last year. We had, one of the largest years of growth in employment, 300,000 last year, that we've seen since the Howard days. So we are seeing growth in our economy. The forecasts that we have are what is provided to us by Treasury, unaltered, and they've confirmed those in the PFO document that are there, and they are well below what the long-run averages have been for growth. So that's where our figures are. If others have different views about what the growth forecasts are, and particularly if the opposition has a different view about what the growth forecasts are, well, obviously then they would also have to accommodate that into how they're projecting forward their expenses and their revenues.
The PFO document, though, is also making clear that if Australia wants to achieve the 10-year budget projections, what is required, and I quote, is renewed vigour in encouraging and delivering structural reform across all parts of the economy. Is that code for you're not doing enough?
Well, what it's code for, I don't think it's code at all, Leigh. It's saying that you can never rest on the job of ensuring that our economy is growing and doing the things that you need to do to ensure the economy is growing.
So are you saying, therefore, that you accept that you're not currently doing enough?
No, what I'm saying is we have a national plan for economic growth, and we've set it out in the budget. We're setting it out in this election, and that starts with our national innovation and science agenda. It's our defence industry plan supporting high-tech jobs for generations. It's the tax cuts for small and medium-sized businesses and hard-working middle-income families. It's the export trade agreement, some 19,000 specific opportunities. It is living within our means to ensure we have a budget where we can guarantee funding for roads and for schools and for hospitals, and it's ensuring we raise the revenue measures we need to by cracking down on multinational tax avoidance and better targeting our superannuation tax concessions.
Today you were claiming that there's a black hole in Labor's spending commitments. Let's just take one aspect of those numbers. You claim that one part of it is a $19 billion spend by Labor on foreign aid. The Shadow Foreign Minister, in fact, announced $800 million over 4 years. If you're prepared to exaggerate and mislead to that degree, how can we trust you on any other figures?
Well, I don't accept that characterisation. What they announced on the weekend was one element, I can assume, of their policy. Now, if Labor is saying...
No, why do you assume that?
Leigh, if Labor is saying that they agree with 90% of the cuts that we've made to foreign aid as a government over the last few years and going forward, well, they should say that. But they have not said that. Now, if that's what Tanya Plibersek wants to say to her electors in Sydney, that they agree with the cuts that we've made to foreign aid, 90% of those cuts she agrees with, then that should be made plain.
But surely you can only base your projections on what they've announced, not what you assume they might announce.
But that's what she did announce. She said she was going to reverse the cuts that we made in the 14-15 MyEFO and the 15-16 budget.
Well, let me quote to you from your own foreign minister on our program last night. Julie Bishop said to me, Tanya Plibersek, having promised for the last 3 years billions of dollars in increased foreign aid, has made an announcement of a modest increase when the aid budget was increasing anyway. So it was a non-event.
No, well, we don't know what other commitments they're planning to make in this area. But
Julie
Leigh,
Bishop says it was a non-event, what they've announced.
Well, Leigh, what I'm saying is, and what we outlined today were a number of things. First of all, we said they had identified $16 billion in budget measures which can pay for things. Now, the first thing they've got to pay for is the $18 billion in measures that they have blocked or say they're opposing in the Senate now. That's $18 billion. That was in PIFO. So they're already $2 billion behind before they've started. On top of that, they have $30 billion in commitments they've made, of additional commitments of promises on spending and not proceeding with other coalition measures. That's $30 billion, including $8 billion they've announced in this election. And then there's this other area in which the one you've referred to is included. Now, that's $35 billion. Now,
that's your assumptions.
Well, that's based on statements that have been made by members of the opposition, and we're simply saying this to them, Leigh. If they want to crab walk away from the things they've said earlier and they want to agree with the position which says that they agree with 90% of the foreign aid cuts we've made, if that's what the Labor Party is saying, fine.
So
we will adjust those numbers.
Shall I apply that standard to you guys as well and assume that states will be levying their own income tax? Because, of course, your own side has
floated that too. We ruled it out, Leigh. We ruled it completely out, and the Labor Party have not ruled out what I've just said.
In a speech last week, the former Treasurer Peter Costello said regarding your $1.6 million cap on tax-free superannuation pension transfers that the government said, and I'm quoting him here, the government said $1.6 million was 4 times the age pension. This is on the assumption of a 5.5% return rate. That's what the government thinks you're going to get. Does it really think that? It's issuing bonds at 2%. So do you really think that?
The calculations are based on a 25-year average earning of 3% above inflation. So 25 years. We don't set these measures for the next 2 years. We set them for the next 25 years. Now, the average return, comparable return over the last 11 years from these funds is 6.2%. So that's what has been achieved. And that includes negative return years, Leigh, during the GFC.
But Peter Costello says if you want that 5.5%, you're going to have to, they're going to have to take on more risk in order to make that return.
Well, they were making 6.2%, and the issue is where the returns are will be based on asset allocation as much as anything else, which is what many fund managers and other advisors have said. But the assumption is based on a 25-year average return of 3% over inflation. Now, that is what Treasury has advised, and that's what those calculations are based on, and that calculation puts the return at around 4 times the earnings of the single-age pension, and the assets cut-off is more than double what the cut-off is for access to the age pension. So we think that's a very reasonable mark to set in terms of better targeting what are very generous superannuation concessions. So you can have a fund of up to $1.6 million in assets, and you pay absolutely no tax on the earnings of that $1.6 million.
Of this same policy, Mr Costello says, the first thing that will happen is that you'll run out of money and go back on the pension, or people will work longer than 65 and put off their retirement. I assume you think Peter Costello is a credible figure.
Well, Peter's one of my mentors, but Peter was dealing with the situation he was in when he was Treasurer, when many of these measures were put in place. We're dealing, and he had a $20 billion surplus, which Labor turned into a $54 billion deficit in just 2 years. So we're dealing with concessions which we believe can no longer be sustained and afforded in this environment, particularly when you've got an ageing population and you've got a growing pool of super balances amongst the most wealthy, upon which there is no taxation on the earnings above $1 1.6 million. And so with an ageing population, you've got to pay your way, and those concessions, as were previously put in place, we don't think are sustainable, and only 1% of people have a balance above 1.6.
Let me whip around a few other quick things before we run out of time. Could Tony Abbott ever again be Liberal leader?
Oh, well, Malcolm Turnbull will be the Prime Minister after this election, should we be re-elected, and that's exactly what we're all working towards.
Could Tony Abbott ever make a comeback?
Well, I don't engage in speculation on those sorts of things. Malcolm Turnbull being Prime Minister is what this country needs. That's what we need right now. That's what we need going forward, so we can implement the national economic plan that he and I and all of the colleagues have put together to ensure we have jobs and growth in a transitioning economy.
A quick question on a totally different subject. You're a very big rugby league fan. You're the #1 ticket holder for the Cronulla Sharks.
Who are on the top of the table, I should stress now, for the first time in 16 years.
Look at you sneaking in that talking point. You're a rusted-on Blues fan. The rugby league great Steve Eller's written a newspaper column today decrying the links between sport and alcohol, prompted by his dismay over an NRL initiative to hand out a free can of VB emblazoned with the Blues jersey. What do you think about that?
Well, look, I'm not going to be a commentator on the sport policy. Those things are properly commented on by the Sports Minister. But I look, responsible service of alcohol, responsible consumption of alcohol, responsible engaging in gambling too. I mean, that's another area which has crept itself into the game, and it's not something that many parents welcome. I think these are things we have to keep a watchful eye on, and there'll be plenty of people with an opinion on that. My opinion is go the Blues and go the Sharks, and I'm looking for a double this year.
Well, as a cane toad, you can get your cockroach self right out of here.
Thank you, Red.
Thank you for joining us.
Cheers.